Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, international humanitarian law, and the Jackson Center itself. During the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Jackson Center. All of these milestones and our planning naturally had us looking to the past to see how far we and the law and the world have come. But we simply cannot rest on our laurels. So it also sparked conversations of where are we trying to go and how do we get there? And that's a little bit of the story behind how we got to our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. And during this year, we will be convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our bi-monthly teas a little bit differently this year. Each month has a particular focus. And in March, we are looking at environmental justice. The first tea each month, which this is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to achieve equity or make progress. The second tea each month is geared to showcase some of those who are doing the work in those areas to close those gaps. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family and friends and colleagues and seek out ways to make changes in your community. For today's conversation, I am excited to be with three members of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, Dr. Jan Fritz, the chair, Sylvia Orduño, sorry, Sylvia, and one of the vice chairs, Mike Tilchin. NEJAC is a federal advisory committee to the Environmental Protection Agency. It was established in September of 1993, and it provides advice and recommendations on a broad and comprehensive range of issues from all of the stakeholders who need to be involved in the environmental justice discussion. Jan, Sylvia, and Mike, thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And one of the things I like about this group is that the three of you represent a number of the different stakeholders when we were talking about that well-rounded conversation. So I am excited that we have academia represented, and we have the community-based organizations represented, and we have some industry represented as well. So I think this is going to be a wonderfully well-rounded conversation. And I'm going to start with a question that I wonder if it differs a little bit for each of you, given your constituencies. And that question is, when we talk about environmental justice, what do we mean by that? And Sylvia, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, thank you. So typically and sadly, traditionally, it's about communities, often communities of color, that are impacted by environmental pollution, toxins, and other kinds of health disparities. And so it's, for many communities, been a long-standing problem. And so when we're talking about environmental justice communities today, it ranges from a variety of factors, not just, say, the sort of companies or businesses that are operating in the area that offer out pollutants, but it's also quality of life factors that impact the way it is that residents there are living healthy, meaningful lives. Oftentimes, those are economically distressed communities as well. They're oftentimes overburdened and underserved. And so when we're talking about how it is that we can actually stop the pollution that is impacting their health in many different ways, we're also talking about how to economically empower those communities to also be able to change their lives.
And that's great. Mike or Jan, is there anything that you would like to add?
I'll add to that. That's Sylvia gave a great introduction. So building on that, in a broad sense, the objective is for all communities, regardless of socioeconomic status, to receive equal environmental protection by the laws, the regulation, the enforcement of those laws and regulations in the country. And the other thing, the other not really the flip side, but closely connected to that, is that the country has a history of bringing, I would say in some cases, forcing disadvantaged communities, to pushing them to live in close and in some cases dangerous contact with the generation of pollution that in some, which has, one could argue historically, has powered society, where the burden of the pollution has been borne by a very small population. The benefits of what those industries have produced are realized by others. So that inequity is a really key aspect of environmental justice.
Absolutely.
If I could add to that, and what they've both mentioned is about fair treatment, and it's also about meaningful participation. And this is kind of the official definition in the United States. In different countries, the term means different things. I would say that's the most common kind of definition. I also like to include fair treatment for the earth. It's not that I don't think that the minority situation shouldn't be the first and foremost part of this, but also somebody needs to speak up for the treatment of the land, the air, the water that is around us. So I like to include that in the definition. And I think the harder part of this is two things, maybe fair treatment. If you said you were treating the majority population poorly and you were also treating the minority population poorly, what would environmental justice be? And if you look at it from the standpoint of people who are a minority population, the other part of that definition is meaningful participation. So how are you going to be identified? How are you going to be heard? How are you going to get the information you need? I've been in communities where that's a real issue, a community that wants to be a Superfund site and can't figure out how to do that, or somebody that's tried to get through the EPA's online system about who I should contact, and the contact isn't a person close to me, or I'm leaving a message and I can't get through to them. So it's what is a meaningful participation. We've got a wonderful system where we put in place that we should have all the government agencies having some kind of environmental justice an indicator, and that people should meet and discuss it. But in some cases, that can be just a nice thing that you put on your website and you haven't moved forward to it. So it's a complex thing in deciding on a definition. And I think Sylvia and Mike have made the biggest points. Maybe I'm just adding a little something.
No, and that's actually, Jen, you sort of walked through some of the points that had resonated with me that we were going to discuss. So you have laid a nice outline for us as well. One of the items that resonated with me on the EPA's website is that the goal of environmental justice will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and that when everyone has equal access to the decision-making process. So they have healthy environments in which they live, learn, and work. And I think that gets to a lot of, obviously that's the umbrella to what each of you have described. And I think is easily digestible and understandable, as these are the goals towards which we're working. And then within that, then NEJAC's mandates and objectives for how do we actually achieve those things. And so I kind of want to break down some of those mandates. So the first mandate is to integrate environmental justice considerations in EPA programs, policies, and activities. And so I think my first question is, how does that work practically? Are there focus areas? Are there, obviously there's a number of things that could be tackled under this umbrella. So how do you even decide what to focus on?
So I can give a first go if it helps. So as a council, there are about 30 members, and we come from different stakeholder groups, as you mentioned earlier, the ones that we're representing here, but there are also non-governmental organizations, tribal and state governments or government. And so what we try to do is to have conversations around issues that come before us. So we develop our own agendas, And so we're also trying to stay current to issues that are happening, but be responsive to what it is that we're hearing in the communities that we also represent. Through the EPA, we are also issued charges or asked to provide feedback in certain issues. And so Mike is working on one right now that he can also share with you about. A recent one that we also did was about water infrastructure a couple of years ago. And we also take a lot of public comments. So every time we meet, we have hours, in fact, of public comment. So we're very responsive to what it is that communities across the country want to report to us or ask for our help on. And then with that, we take into consideration what is it that we've heard from different voices, and how is it that we can start identifying the priorities that we believe we need to get some attention on through the EPA and form committees, working groups, draft letters to the administrator, or figure out other kinds of hearings that need to be had.
Okay. Are there currently, oh yes, Mike, go ahead, please.
Yeah, as Sylvia mentioned, one of the charges, which is essentially a direction that we get from the EPA administrator, was to take a deep dive into the Superfund program, which is the nation's program for cleaning up abandoned hazardous waste sites. These are, the sites that are, notoriously the most contaminated sites in the country. And it is not the least bit surprising that disadvantaged communities are more likely to be living in close proximity, to have their water, their land, their air impacted by this contamination. And the work that we're doing that's focused on Superfund is to essentially examine what the program needs to do to essentially, going back to those core principles of environmental justice, to ensure that the cleanup in those communities are as thorough, as performed as expeditiously, and picking up on a critical point that Jan made, that the work that's done and the work that is left behind when the land is cleaned up is fully informed and responsive to the needs of the community. That's such a critical aspect. And I can't cheat and tell you what's in the report because we haven't released it yet, but that really embodies a very significant portion of the recommendations and strategies for how to do a better job of engaging the community fully, incorporating that input, and having both the cleanup and then the actions to restore that community not be imposed because it's someone else's idea of what that community really needs, but it's informed by what the community tells us is what its priorities are, what enhances the quality of life for them, having been burdened by living, having your neighbor a toxic hazardous waste site. And Kristen, I'm gonna have to excuse myself for just a few minutes, but I will be right back.
No worries. Thank you, Mike. That feels, what Mike just said also feels, I'm not sure if it's an important difference or maybe it's growth of these efforts as well, that these solutions or these discussions feel like they're no longer top down, that they are really generating from the community and coming up. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Is the shift I sort of am perceiving actually there, or was it always sort of more community, but the community was having a hard time being heard? I'm just curious as to how does that dynamic work?
So the fight for environmental justice really has been a long time struggle. And so it's actually pretty unique that we have a council as we do in the EPA, or really anywhere in government, in federal government especially. And so this has actually been the result of social movement groups. For many years, people who organize in communities and been trying to bring attention to the issues of environmental pollution, contamination, and the solutions that communities have for how to address these, and really wanted to prioritize their needs and their voices and make sure that they are getting the due process, resources, and representation that they deserve on the issues. And so while many of the issues sort of have local origins, they have larger impacts, right? They affect how it is that we really understand what it means to live in safe, healthy communities, to even have enforcement of the laws that we have right now, say like our Safe Drinking Water Act and others. And so one of the things that NEJAC has done is try to sort of be a vigilant council that is paying attention to the issues and being responsive as well. And so we really see ourselves as taking orders from EJ communities and being responsive in that way, and knowing that we have to do all that we can to also hold elected officials accountable and responsible. So our role within the EPA allows us to sort of maneuver in those ways, to be engaged with EPA staff, and especially now in the Biden administration, to also have the formation of other environmental justice councils taking place across the administration. And so we were delighted to be able to participate in a first conversation just a few weeks ago with the White House Environmental Justice Council leadership that is forming. And so it's giving a lot of hope that there's actually going to be some real responses to the needs that communities have been raising for many years.
Perfect. And Jan, I'm guessing that a large part, and I'm turning to you as the academia representative here, is I suspect a lot of this also requires a fair amount of research and, really helping people understand what are the impacts. Obviously you have sort of the human observable, but is someone studying sort of the long term? How are we accounting for, since the council has been around for almost 30 years now, sort of that history of buildup or of documentation of these issues as well?
A lot of times academics just speak to other academics and they're not involved with policy. I think that it helps for those two sides to get together most frequently. What's interesting about this movement coming out of the late 60s and then in the 80s is a number of those movements also put out reports. So they weren't necessarily coming from academia. They were coming from community groups who saw something that needed to move forward. And sometimes academics were part of those groups or driving it, but they were included in, but it was really community-based to move things forward. I look back at my own experience in this. I went to NEJAC meetings when I was not a member of NEJAC, because we used to have the bus tours that were connected with it. And for me, that was the most important thing. I want to see what it is we're talking about. I want to be with the people who are affected by something. And when I came and was selected to be on NEJAC, I found they weren't doing the bus tours anymore. So as an academic who had a long history here, I really pushed for, this is something we really need to institute and put back in place. One of the values of this is particularly how it's done under EPA and in NEJAC is we have, just as you've mentioned, that each of us represent different constituencies. That's a set part of the advisory council. And so you're here talking with people who work with state governments. You're here talking with people who work with the environmental justice groups. I've found that sometimes people who attend the meetings want to speak, but other people have just come because they want to hear what the different people have said about things. So I think my point in rambling on here is that seeing what people are experiencing is really important. Giving resources to community groups and encouraging researchers and academia to work together with community groups and moving things forward is really, really important.
Well, and that's, as I was having a conversation with someone locally about our program today, and they were very curious about NEJAC. That was their first exposure to it. And they said, well, is business involved? Because if you don't have buy-in of all of these groups, and if they aren't all working somewhat together, then it feels as if progress would not be able to be made. And so it feels as if that partnership you just described, Jan, and I'm sure there are other partnerships out there as well, is really critical to closing this gap, this equity gap, and advancing the principles of environmental justice.
In fact, if you don't mind me trying to show my picture here.
Go right ahead.
This is a picture of a plant. And this is from Mossville, Louisiana. When that community people moved in there, there were none of these things around it. Now the place looks like this. It doesn't look like those houses that we've talked about. And I remember sitting on a porch, people invited me. This is one of the NEJAC tours. And I went there, did the tour, and then I went back and drove out there to spend time with the people. And they invited me to sit on their porch. And I sat in that rocking chair looking at what was across from them. At night, it's beautiful. You have all these colors coming out of these various things. buildings and smoke, you know, it's and a lot of lights, you know, it looks like an amusement park across from you. But the question is, it wasn't something they wanted. They didn't like the effects of what was going on. And our job is to not only help people do that, but to have their voices directly heard about whatever it is that's going on in their communities.
Well, and that's a nice segue into the second of the NEJAC mandates and objectives, is to improve the environment and public health in the communities that are disproportionately burdened by these environmental harms and risks. And so I think my question there is, does this mean, are we more focused in this on the remediation and the improvement? Are we also still looking at how do we stop this, or how do we change the consideration that lawmakers or business have before these things go in, or before these types of areas are established?
Mm-hmm. It's all of it, and it all has to happen at the same time. But one of the things that we have to be more sensitive to is what it is that communities are saying are their priorities, what's driving their immediate needs. And for some, it is immediate cleanup of some disastrous toxins or spills or anything that's happening at a given time, and whether or not there even has to be extraordinary measures like evacuations or whatever those things are that have to be addressed in a short-term sense. But again, like when we're talking about environmental justice communities, the issue of legacy pollutions, legacy communities is one of the more dire aspects of this, right? Where we've got generations of people who are living under the same toxins. And I can tell you, I'm here in Detroit, and there are residents who live in particular communities out near the refineries, downwind of where their houses are, and they can talk about neighbors and family members who have died with cancer, right, for over many years, generations, and it's sad to hear that the things that folks have experienced, and how you just come to expect that you and your children will have asthma, or you will have some other kinds of respiratory conditions because that's just where you live and you can't afford to move. And redlining has been a reason why you are also there. So we have to especially pay attention to the racial justice aspects of environmental justice. And so part of that means we have to reckon with a lot of things we've done wrong in this country in terms of how it is we've treated people, how we've denied them the opportunity to live full lives, and even designated them to communities that were harmful for their own well-being. And so as we're looking at what it is that we need to do to drive those changes, we have to have responsibility, accountability, and solutions from all sectors of society, right? So it's not just what it is that we're going to be requiring of our local, state, or federal governments, but also what it is we're requiring from everyone who benefits from the communities in which we live. So small businesses, corporations, everyone who has some way of impacting or influencing the quality of life where people live. And so when we're even talking about how it is that we get rid of the environmental pollutants that we have right now, some of the things are around changing the way that we operate, whether it's shifting to kind of green aspects of how it is that we derive our energies, or whether it is that we change the way that we manufacture particular products. And we don't necessarily want to shift these environmental pollutants to, other nations or other states or cities. We don't want to see that happening either, right? We don't want to just displace the problem. We want to actually change it. So it requires a real shift in how it is that we're willing to approach the needs and the cost and the responsibilities.
Are we also building in, I guess I would call it, maybe forward-looking analysis as well? We're dealing with a lot of new technologies now. We're dealing with a lot of new ways of doing things that we don't potentially know what the ramifications or the effects will be. And so is it also now greater mindfulness of, yeah, maybe periodically we need to take a step back and review these things more carefully, or be more sensitive when people start reporting impacts that area had not been seeing before, or changes to people's health or things along that line? Is that also part of the conversation?
Do you want to jump in, Jan? Otherwise I can.
It is part of the conversation, but I think people often don't have available to them the information about, for instance, pesticides that are being used. While I'm a professor at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, I happen to live in Florida. And I was shocked when I came down here because often people are living in kind of close proximity to each other, and they've hired people to spray whatever on their land. And because it's very windy, everything is shared. And I found people didn't even know what was being sprayed, what the effects of it could be. There is a place here where we've got water problems, algae showing up in a lot of different places. My mother, who would come down here and visit, she died this last year at 106, and she was very on top of everything. And she groaned every time she visited down here. Why haven't these people stopped doing what they're doing and getting on top of this? She would go to senior conversation groups, and they would all sit around, and she said, it's just like every year I come down here and it's the same conversation. Why don't they fix this? So I think both people understanding what's going on, and I found what was very effective when I did a workshop. I put up a map of a community, and every danger place that we knew in the community was indicated, and gave people 2 little somethings to stick on there where they lived and where they worked. We could hardly get them back in the room to listen to the discussions because people were all of a sudden looking at what was going on somewhere or what had gone on there. And they would ask, what was there? Why is that street being, I live down on the next street. I didn't know about this. So I think providing people with information is the first thing. I mean, the lesson here about all environmental justice is it's come out of the community groups. So giving the community information, allowing them to share information, to push policymakers to be able to do something about what needs to be done. We are so late in working on these things. If you've got children, you got to be thinking about this.
Well, and that education, the necessity that you just mentioned too, is, I have to imagine, one of the hardest parts of this, because if there are not perhaps readily evident or even en masse reactions or health problems or something, a lot of this might sort of fall under the radar. So you may not even be aware that you are in, as you said, a trouble zone or something like that. Any thought are you discussing? How do you start educating people so they are aware of this? That just seems very daunting to me at the moment when I'm trying to think of educating, a couple 100 million people on, here's actually what's going on in your neighborhood that you need to be aware of.
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little about education, Mike?
I actually wanted to pick up on what Kristen just said, and this is not a solution in all cases, but there is in the US, and actually to a greater extent in other countries, actually a very helpful bringing together of community concern, technology, sort of combining to create really good and important citizen science. And what I mean by that is this. One of the things that is, kind of, I think, at a core of environmental injustice is when a community is exposed to contamination and is unaware of it and is not made aware of it. Mm. And that is a persistent, chronic, historic, current, and it's going to be a future problem, all of the above. However, I think there's actually a very positive however here, and that is that through technology, there are accurate, relatively inexpensive, and easy to use monitoring devices that a community can essentially own and operate and know when the discharge, when the air pollution control has gone down on their neighborhood manufacturing facility and they're breathing really terrible air. It gives them power in 2 ways. They can act in a way basically to defend themselves, and they can take the initiative to begin enforcement, to bring that to the attention of the regulators and force action. So I think that that the ability to provide, maybe this is different than the education piece, so forgive me, but it's something I think is really important. It's connected to it.
It all sounds part and parcel of the same thing. So
yeah, it's connected to it. But giving communities the power to know what's happening in their environment more or less in real time is, I think, potentially transformational to environmental protection in the United States and everywhere, by the way, but most significantly in environmental justice communities.
Well, one thing I want to add, and thank you for that, Mike and Jan, is what's key to all this is justice, right? We know that that plant that was built over there 50 years ago has been trouble, right? And we knew that when it came in, the promise of jobs was luring and all the tax credits that go along with it, and all of the hope for what it was going to do for the community. In many ways, they never get really fully fulfilled, right? The number of jobs really don't end up getting delivered as promised. The number of pollutants that, or the monitoring of that, is always higher than they say it will be. And any kind of other benefits to the community in terms of even community benefit agreements always find a way to not come down in the way that the community needs. And what happens is oftentimes communities are the ones that have to bear the burden of not only reporting, but monitoring and seeking justice or relief for what is happening. There's been a failure both in our corporate communities and in our governments in terms of making sure that they are delivering upon the promises of what it means to provide for public health and what it means to also ensure that there are not disproportionate peoples that are being impacted. And that's exactly what's been happening, right? And we've allowed it. We've been cognizant of the fact that it's unhealthy. We would not want to live there when we're making the decisions about where we're going to move or raise families. We know where we don't want to live, right? And we know people that are sort of stuck living where they're at, right? And for many residents, those are the family homes that people have had for generations. It was the only home that maybe their family was able to afford. But again, like I said, when we look at how it comes to be that those environmental injustice communities were established and how it is that they've sustained, we've had a lot of ways in which we have not allowed those companies, governments to be held accountable, and how we haven't really directly found ways to address the relief that's been needed. So it's not like it's a big secret that communities are saying, it's not healthy here. We can't keep living like this. And it's really impacting us. And we've got all these things that are monitoring, telling us that the numbers are bad and that sometimes we're going to have to. And I'm thinking when I was growing up, I grew up actually in Los Angeles, and we had smog alerts, right? And so it was well known that if the number was over a certain thing, we couldn't go out to play in the playground. We had to stay inside for our breaks and for lunch. And so we've known for years how impactful it is also in children. And you can look in any kind of internet search and see playgrounds and schools that are backdropped against some kind of chemical plant or other kinds of unsafe zone. And so we know that what the problems are, we just haven't had the resolve or the resources to address them as needed. And so that really is what it has to be today. And so it really is about a political choice. As much as it's economic, it's also about a political choice. And so that's what I think that we're really seeing, especially in the national reckoning that we had last year with Black Lives Matter, and other kinds of calls for racial equity and justice, is to say, look, let's really take this closer look at what's happening in our communities and what can we do to address it. And in the case of environmental justice, there's much more we can be doing in terms of what technology offers and what we know better about how to either manufacture things or provide better for our communities. So that's, I think, a lot of what we're hoping this year is going to provide in terms of some of that promise.
No, and that sounds great. And that actually leads us into the third mandate. So, to address environmental justice by ensuring meaningful involvement in decision-making and building the capacity in those disproportionately burdened communities and promoting this collaborative problem solving. And Jan alluded to this a little bit in her intro. So I'm going to start with you first. What does meaningful involvement actually mean in this case? How do we know what are the parameters for, yes, this is meaningful involvement?
Well, I think, this is a very important question. And I think, I think, the answer is, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think, the answer is, yes, this is meaningful involvement. And, I think,
And Jan, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Okay, that's really important. First of all, voices have to be heard directly, and then who's hearing them? I can remember at one of the early NEJAC meetings, somebody had made a very impassioned plea during a public comment period about what needed to be done, and said to the chair, so this is what we need done. And the chair said, I don't think you understand. We're an advisory committee. And the person said, well, who is it that's making the decisions? Why am I talking to you? Get the person out here who's supposed to do this. And one of the things about public comment, you are talking to an advisory committee who's going to give information on, but that doesn't mean that that's the direct contact. So I think it's really important not only to get the forces together and to provide knowledge to people, but to figure out ways to get directly to the people who make decisions. And one of the things I always tell my students, consider running for public office. You know, it's a lot easier to be in the position to make the decisions that need to be done than to have to organize a community to try to get the person or people to move forward on something. So if you care about something, move not only forward in the community, but move forward on the political front or figure out ways to be able to do that.
And Mike, I see you nodding your head as well. So I feel as if you have something to add to this.
Yeah. Well, what I really, the story that Jan told, I think is just, it's so short and so succinct. One of our jobs as part of NEJAC is to make those decision makers uncomfortable if they're not doing the right things. It is true that we don't get to make the final decision, but we can be a voice for communities and apply pressure in a way that is public. And public officials, tend to respond to public pressure if it's strong, unified, with a clear and obviously just message. We don't get to, dictate this must be corrected. This action must be taken. But we can apply we can apply pressure and apply it effectively to the very best of our ability. And I would say this, and I'm probably jumping the gun, it's really important who's listening. And that has changed in a profound way 50 days ago.
And that is one of my questions is, this administration seems much more focused on environmental justice. Sylvia, you mentioned the White House Environmental Justice Council, and just even in the last few days, John Kerry in Europe and having those conversations. And so since there is seeming to me a greater focus at this time, and what do you hope to do with that momentum? What will that enable you to do?
It's changed the discourse for one, and it matters because when you have that kind of conviction from the top, it actually carries down to the communities, right? All the way down to the neighborhood. And so we have a lot of people that are paying attention and trying to figure out, well, what is it really going to mean in terms of some kind of meaningful impacts? So it was the feeling that pretty clearly on that the Biden administration was intending to do something about this. So when we saw back in January that they issued the executive order on climate change that also sought to deliver upon environmental justice concerns, it was a really good indication of how it is that we felt we could also now put additional pressures in even our local governments, right, or our state governments, because now we were having to find how it is that we could deliver on those. And so one of the things that has mattered is we already see regular engagement taking place with EPA and other agencies of the administration that are engaging in public comments again. And that's significant just in itself, right? Because they're saying, look, communities across the country, tribal lands, we want to hear from you. We want you to tell us what are your priorities, what are your needs, and what is it that you are expecting of us to do. And so while that is always important, we have to be sure that we're also delivering the resources, because it's not just about just reporting, but actually delivering. And so what's been promising too is in that same executive order, the president came forward with an initiative called Justice 40, that would provide 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments back into these disadvantaged communities. And so it actually gave us something measurable to see in terms of what we could at least be counting on that we haven't had over actually many administrations. And so to have it placed so front and center with climate justice makes it actually feel as we might actually have an opportunity to make some transformational changes here in these next few years.
And I think that's, we talk about even when we set goals for our own organizations, that they need to be measurable. You need to know sort of what you're advancing towards. And so what you were just describing also seems good, just good management progress process in general for, okay, now we have an understanding of what the goalposts are, and not that, I mean to say that there was always the larger understanding of the goalpost, but now there are measurable steps for how do we start advancing towards that environmental justice umbrella parameter that everybody has that equity. And so that's very encouraging to hear. I'm going to remind our audience to ask questions at any time. And while they are formulating their questions, I'm going to ask you all a few more. So one of the things that it looks like NEJAC is taking a special interest in, or spearheading an effort on, is how to bring in youth voices into this conversation as well, with the especially with regard to climate change. And I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about that effort as well. And Sylvia, maybe I'll start with you on that.
So it's funny because that's actually one of the conversations that we regularly have in NEJAC is we've got to get younger members onto the council. And so there isn't necessarily a youth seat, but I can tell you that we probably have a good if not significant number of people who provide public comments being among younger members of our nation. And so they are there to deliver upon what the issues are and give us a solution, and then say, look, we're going to be watching, so the accountability piece is also there as well. And so I think what's also exciting is that we've got a lot of folks who have been also doing a lot of climate justice work within their communities and states. And so that's really where it's going to matter in many ways about how we actually change the ways in which we're operating in our small towns and our cities, and how it is that we can then take those measures and get the federal government to provide the investment that's also needed to help secure those. And so I think we also need to have like a level of honesty, though, in that there's going to be pushback, right? It's not going to be something I think that all sectors agree on or all communities agree on how those changes should happen. But what has been significant is that the folks that are leading this in many of our younger communities and organizations, they are driven towards believing that this is the only way that they're going to survive and that our earth is going to survive. And so they're coming with really not only like interesting ideas, but also they want to be part of that work to make it happen. And so they're assuming leadership positions in many of their communities and driving the change. And so I think that what we've got to do is figure out how it is that we can do this in multi-sector ways, because we're not having enough of those conversations within the industries that we're sort of needing to make the kinds of change that need to be happening. And we're not actually changing enough of the policies at the local levels that allow for that. We're seeing a lot more advisory committees pop up around climate justice, environmental justice. And so the spaces are opening for that kind of engagement. But I think that we've got to figure out too how it is that we can get even more short-term wins, because I think people are going to get frustrated if we can't actually show that, look, it's possible to do smaller changes soon. And so one of the spaces that I know we're seeing that is how we can even do our water infrastructure differently, right? There's a number of communities that are talking about, well, we can actually change the way that the stormwater runs off, and we can collect it in other kinds of ways so that we're recycling. And so it actually helps with the vibrancy of communities too. And you get people that want to be involved in that kind of process. You're planting new gardens. And so there's lots of ways that it can even happen at the very local neighborhood levels.
No, and that, that sort of momentum and that sort of, so much of this work actually, and so much of all of the conversations we've been having are this work has been in progress. This work will continue to be in progress. And as I think Mike said at the beginning of this, like this will continue to be challenges. So, we don't really know how long this road is, but to get that momentum and have some of those smaller, or help people understand as well, I can change this one thing right here. And while that may not seem as if that has a global impact, that's part of the stepping stone for how do I get to that larger impact. And I think that sounds really important. I think that's one of the reasons why our audience tunes into these conversations, is trying to figure out and look around their own community with how can they affect change there, and what do they need to be looking for. So that sounds great. Jan or Mike, anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think I've been sort of depressed the last few years about our progress in a lot of areas on environment. And I think a lot of people who are like me are hopeful and maybe have high expectations. And you've got to realize there's going to be some time to move things along. But one of the things I would look at is we had this push to have interagency environmental justice interests. I sure would look at each area to see how that's playing out, because I don't think it's been strong enough in some areas. It's not enough for me to see a statement on the website. I want to see how it is that it works in each of these areas. So I'm hoping that will be one of the things that we move forward on. I'm also very curious about this council that will be developed out of the White House on environmental justice, and how that's going to work in conjunction with other efforts that have taken place in other places. So I'm hoping that we can pick, as you mentioned, something to work on, that you move on quickly, not that something's a 200-page report and takes a year and a half to be able to develop, but what are we going to be doing? Because we need some short-term show we mean business, we've made something different. And some longer ones as well. So setting some priorities and showing that this can work is really important.
Kristen, what I would add to that, the question about the engagement of youth, not that there isn't room for additional growth, but I personally have been, I would say inspired to act because of the energy of young people. And there are, while there are lots of constituents in society that have driven the message of the unbelievable urgency to act on climate change, I would say no group has been more effective in communicating that than young people. And that has translated, I'll connect it to something else Jan said, and that is young people being politically really active. They were really active in the last couple of elections. That's, it's truly different, and it's, it is measurable. You look at the percentage of people under 35 that are going to the polls, it has really changed. And that makes me very hopeful.
Great. All right. We have a question from Helena. Where do you think you'll see the most immediate or the largest benefits as a result of the federal investment in this work? May all have different thoughts. So Sylvia, I think I'm going to start with you and see if anything immediately comes to mind.
I think, again, what we're looking forward first is for the federal investment. So while there's always a need to continue to monitor and report, study, do all the kinds of public hearings that need to be had, there have been a lot of studies sort of sitting on the shelf, a lot of local recommendations for what the changes need to be. And so in many ways, we just need to get the resources down to communities so that those changes can be addressed. And for many of them, as Mike has also shared, like with the Superfund Task Force, is that these are deep issues, right, that are going to take substantial time and cost. And so I think as we're doing this in combination with a number of the other things that are being addressed, whether it's new types of transportation or new types of housing or other kinds of economic opportunities or changes, that they need to be done at the same time that we're looking at whatever these kinds of cleanup efforts are, or changes in how it is that we're reducing toxins, or making sure that we're not contributing to, new and emerging problems. And so we see that happening all the time. One of the areas that I work on especially is around water. And so the large national problem with PFAS contamination in almost all of our drinking water sources in one way or another is something that is pretty alarming. And also in Michigan, we've been very focused on the problems of lead. And so we've been doing a lot of work at the state and local level to try to address those and get a number of policy and bills passed to try to protect the communities. But ultimately, we really do have to have the resolve of the federal government providing the resources so that we can make the changes and address the problems as they've happened. So this is why I'm going to keep saying that the hope of the Biden administration is really, I think, what is a lot of what many of us are counting on right now. And so we need to see that actually happens.
Mike or Jan, anything you want to add to that?
No, not me.
Yeah, a couple of comments. In the two, so the question is a great question about, where are the biggest impacts going to be? It might have been most immediate. Piggybacking on what Sylvia said, the investment in clean and safe drinking water, and I'll get a little more specific, but we are going to decarbonize our society, and the most aggressive investment is in conversion to all forms of mobility being electrified. So we're not going to be selling gasoline powered cars in basically a decade, a little more than that. And that's going to make a huge, and there's a significant investment in that direction that's coming, and that's going to make a huge difference in society.
Okay, got it. All right. Before we get to the lightning round of questions, I think I have a question. I feel like we've touched on this a few places, but I want to ask this explicitly as well. Where or to what issues do you wish people were paying more attention? Are there things that we, the general public, don't seem at all focused on or at all worried about that you as experts and you as people who are really in this world think, gosh, if you only knew or would only educate yourself on this, what would those areas be, or what would those topics be that you wish we were paying more attention to?
I have a comment that I think is relevant enough. And that is, and specifically thinking in the context of NEJAC and EPA. And I'll even tie it back to the Superfund program, but it really applies to multiple EPA programs. There are many, as an agency, EPA has this wonderful mission to protect human health and the environment. And it has done an enormous amount of good over the 50 years that it's been in existence. And in Superfund and in other programs as well, it has been focused on preventing further and future harm. What it hasn't done, and this would be sort of transformational, is focused on not only protecting you from future dangers, but restoring health to those communities that have been historically harmed. And to the extent that that the agency is going to essentially expand its aperture of what its mission is, it's not only protection, it's going to be what do we for the United, and as Jan will remind me, it's not just about the people, it's about the land. And I want to say I totally get that and totally agree with that. But that notion of not only preventing exposure to pollution, but bringing resources to communities to help them elevate their level of health and well-being is sort of like the next level that we'd like to see this EPA get to.
And an area that I've been working in for, gosh, 2 decades now is on water affordability. And so we've had many problems in the state of Michigan, particularly in Detroit, Flint, and many of the former emergency manager cities here that were taken over with people who are unable to afford to pay their water bills. And so we've seen families that have been infected for not just like weeks, months, but years, living without water and adequate sanitation. And so we were able to have a big impact in the governor's decision last year to require all water operators to restore water service to anyone who had been disconnected for the sake of protecting public health, so that people could properly wash their hands with soap and water at home to prevent the reduce the expansion of the pandemic. And so we are very much paying attention to, again, how it is that we have to continue to talk about the importance of not just water for life, how, you know, our bodies are basically made up of mostly water, but how it is that we have to find ways to deal with the huge infrastructure problems that we have across the country. Like, for instance, we have nearly 6 million lead service lines across the country, and they are all in the ground and beyond their expiration dates. We've got to find a way to either remove them or get them repaired or replaced, and they're at huge cost. And so what typically happens is that those costs for those bonds or other kinds of loans are rolled over onto the water bills of customers. So it's an unsustainable practice because people who are already unable to afford their bills can't bear the additional costs. So we really have to look at what this means for how it is that we can maintain the not only just like the dignity, but the public health that we all require for making sure that we can live safely. But this also impacts communities, not just in urban and suburban communities, but also in rural communities where a lot of residents are also having to provide for their own wells or septic tank replacements and repairs. And those are enormous household costs as well. We've got to be able to figure out how it is that we can address these problems nationwide so that we can all have the safe drinking water and sanitation we need.
Okay.
I was going to add something. I think the one lesson of the pandemic has been that people actually have now started to look at what goes on in other countries more than they may have before. And I think when we talk about this, we can't talk about just a solution in the US. I think what Mike said is rather optimistic about the carbon stuff in 10 years. You know, we've got a substantial population here in poverty, and I don't know anybody that can afford an electric car at this point, but okay. And we haven't put the charging stations in place. There would have to be a huge investment in infrastructure to move this forward. But the point of all this is we need to look at, we're the third largest country. China and India are ahead of us. And all those countries in terms of size that are behind us, they need to have the resources. Just as we've seen in the pandemic, some of these places aren't going to get vaccine forever. Even if we make changes here, we have to figure out ways to be able to move the world along, not just here. And we need to look at, as the water rises, I was in the Philippines, and I really hadn't thought about it much, but living on an island with the rise of water, you want to talk about migration between the Mexico and US, let's talk migration. If we let that water rise, there are going to be a lot of people that need to be relocated from where they are. So it's not, we need to be an example here, but we also need to do that outreach effort to help people with different circumstances than we have also be able to move along. And we need to do that cooperatively with other countries.
No, I appreciate you pointing that out, Jan. I think that I agree with you that I think if the pandemic has taught us anything is that we cannot afford to only be within our boundaries or only within our silos. That cannot be the only place that we're focused on the people and the change that is necessary, because that leaves out a lot of the people and the things that will affect us. So yes. All right. Lightning round questions. First question. What progress do you hope to see in the next year? And Sylvia, I'm going to start with you.
I am hoping that we will be able to get national legislation on affordable water and sanitation.
Okay. Jan?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think We've been having discussions about our meetings, and I would like more people to attend the environmental justice meetings. This one is going to be online, give public comment. Let us know what you want. Let the people who are making those decisions hear you. Let us help you make those voices heard. But I'm not sure which ones are going to be first. There's so many problems. It's sort of overwhelming.
Okay, Mike?
In the next year, I expect to see progress in a much higher level of alignment and collaboration across federal agencies dealing with protection of human health and the land, and that's going to make a big difference in sort of a very kind of granular level. What I expect to see in the next year are communities applying for grants to, whether it's clean up a brownfield site or conduct some other get support for conducting some other activity that protects the environment and elevates the well-being of the community, for those to be simplified, for them to be more accessible, and for them to essentially be coordinated across agencies that are working on similar issues in slightly different ways. I do think that'll happen by March of 2022. How about that?
That's a very ambitious goal. I like it. Okay.
Yeah.
What gives you hope that progress will be made? I'm going to go in reverse order this time. So Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one.
This is both simple and complex. The commitments from both the current administration, from the leaders that have been either put in place or have been nominated to be put in place, and combined with the meeting of the moment. I mean, this is something that the political leadership and the citizens of the United States seem to me to be strongly aligned upon, and we're not stopping. I would say, I would say that things like the passage of the COVID relief bill give me optimism that we're not only going to do that, we're going to do other stuff.
Okay. All right, Jan, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question given your answer to the original question. Do you have hope that progress will be made?
I don't have a lot of hope. I really would like to have and I'm a mediator. Mediators are always optimistic. And I just think this is so overwhelming. I work not only in Ohio at a university, I work in South Africa. And so I go and I work in a lot of other countries because I'm a UN representative for the International Sociological Association. So each time I'm visiting somewhere, if I had a shred of hope when I started, I just realized that people don't have enough information. And one of the things I found that's interesting in this country is when you talk with elementary and junior high school people about having a focus on something like this, it's not that they don't care, but they feel like everybody's asking. The focus should be on science, the focus should be on math, the focus should be on English, and they are overwhelmed, and they're often teaching to tests. So making that kind of leap to have this as a kind of focus. And I find young people are interested, but interest sometimes as you move toward your career gets lost. And I think we've got to find a way to have a sustained interest about this. This is not a long-term situation. This is on your doorstep today, and in many communities it was yesterday. So my hope is that the political establishment will not see this just as let's put a picture up about the environment or environmental justice, but really figuring out in the area they work what needs to be done and making it a high priority.
Okay. And Sylvia, what gives you hope?
I think it's seen so many environmental justice groups that have really developed their skills and their knowledge base. And so if you look at, basically, I think you can look at any state, if you look up at least a state-based organization, and many places have local groups, there's enormous skills and potential there for the kinds of leadership that we need, and also a lot of young people, right? When we're talking about where do we find folks that are doing the work. And so when you're having to do work that's essentially a fight for your life or your family's life, you have to figure out what are those solutions. And so these are folks that know everything from the technical aspects of what the pollutants are to what it is that they do in terms of the health, but also they're offering up the kinds of policies and solutions that can drive the conversations, right? And so they're very engaged. And so I think if anything, if you haven't been participating or aware of those kinds of spaces before, look them up, because they are typically open meeting spaces where they invite people from the community to come in and listen and learn. And you'll see that there's a considerable amount of like really deep engagement and a wealth of knowledge.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to ask each one of you to name another organization or another, I don't know if it's an agency or even a person, who else is doing good work to make progress on environmental justice issues. Jan, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Filmmakers. Dark Waters is a popular film, Mossville, if you haven't seen it. But I really appreciate that the funding sources that are putting some money, the community groups that are supporting this, and the people who are taking action. There are so many people doing good work in their local communities, but I think the more we can bring something like that to a general audience is really helpful.
Okay, great. Mike?
There are so many organizations. I'm going to kind of connect a couple of things that are doing good work. And if I was given a kind of a broad class, I would say it is local non-governmental organizations. There's so many of them. I think about the Washington D.C. area. I'll make a pitch. I know I probably not fair, but the Anacostia Watershed Society is a group that I've been engaged in the Washington, D.C. area for a long time. They're doing tremendous work in the watershed, both in cleaning up the Anacostia and elevating the communities. And I know that there are, at least hundreds, if not thousands of organizations doing that level of work. And let's connect that back to what Sylvia said. You can find great organizations where you live doing important things to improve the environment and the quality of life in your community. And if you can find the opportunity to get involved in those organizations, it's not only tangible, it's really rewarding.
Perfect. Sylvia?
I would have to say it's kind of this whole collection of what we're calling water warriors. And they're women from First Nations down to women who work in communities where they've been impacted by water insecurity and are trying to promote what we need to do better to ensure that we have safe drinking water that's also accessible and affordable. You will find that these women are holding up a lot of the sort of water policy and water education work that's taking place in many places around the country. And there are also a lot of ones that are on the front lines of protest and also actions to stop negative actions that are taking place or to enforce the protection of drinking water sources. And so I think if you even look up just water warriors in any given place, you'll see different names that sort of got attached to some of our leaders nationally, but particularly in our First Nation communities.
Perfect. Okay.
Yep.
All right. And the
Can
final
can I add one? Can I add
Yes,
one?
go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So I'm going to, they've been around for a long time. They're everywhere. There are state chapters. I happen to really like the League of Conservation Voters.
Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. Last lightning round question for our audience. What should we be reading? Who should we be listening to? What podcast should we be tuning into to educate ourselves more? I don't know, to be really scared, to want to do work. What are you listening to? What are you recommending? What is exciting you in the reading, thinking, podcasting space about this right now? Jan, I'm going to start with you, I think.
Okay, it's got to be Robert Bullard. Robert has been with us from the beginning. He writes in very clear language. Anybody should be able to pick up a book. For those of you who are a little turned off by books, There are a million YouTube presentations, so go just put the name in Bullard and you'll be able to find him. I remember one lecture he was given, they put up behind him all the books that he had written, and he was pointing to them and talking about them, and then he goes, oh, they're actually all the same thing. And they aren't, but the theme is there, and his work is really good. So the other thing I would recommend is the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council can be found through the EPA website. We have these meetings, you can access them, please attend, please take part in the public comment, please submit written comments, because this next time apparently several people wanted it to be much shorter for public comment than I think it should be. But we do accept written statements, and this is something that moves things forward. Please take part.
Absolutely, and we have posted both NEJAC and the EPA website in our comments as well, so they are readily accessible to our audience. Mike.
Yeah, I was thinking about trying to do a quick, run through my mental files of things that I have looked at recently that I thought were really unusually good. One of them, it's an issue that I don't think we've talked about at length here, and it is connected to environmental justice. And it's the issue of when you're engaged in something that is actively kind of elevating a community, there are some downside risks to long-term residents through gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go back to the Anacostia River because happens to be what I know. There is a group called Building Bridges Across the River, connected to what's called 11th Street Bridge Park. They developed an equitable development plan that I think is extraordinary, and it's something and it describes a multi-year effort to ensure that long-term residents realize the full benefit and the opportunities to stay where they are if that's their choice, as improvements are made, more amenities come in, and housing values rise, so people are not displaced. So the equitable development plan for the 11th Street Bridge Park, I think, is the best work in that area that's been done in the country.
Okay.
The other thing I would recommend, and this connects essentially public housing and environmental justice and exposure to contamination. There's a great study that was done by the Shriver Center on Law and Poverty,
Mm-hmm.
called Poisonous Homes. I think I just was really impressed by the quality of work that they did there. And it was both in the description of the problem and the solutions.
Perfect. All right, Sylvia.
So there's a couple of things. In fact, I'll put a link here. For anyone who's not familiar, over at the EPA, there's this amazing senior policy analyst and researcher. His name is Charles Lee, and he's written, he's doing a lot of writing these days, but he's got a piece from last year that's called Charting a Path Forward for Environmental Justice. And he's actually someone who's been very significant in the movement for environmental justice over the years, and is someone who is well sought out and also does a lot of convenings with other social movement groups, but also universities. And so over at the University of Michigan School for Environmental Science, there's a regular symposium that takes place over there. And so on the university's website, you can see a number of the speakers from different symposiums that are very much worth the view. In fact, they break them up so they're kind of not too long, where you can maybe watch for 15, 20 minutes. So I would say if you went to the University of Michigan website and then also read this piece by Charles, I think it would give you a good overview of some of the issues that are taking place these days.
Perfect. And then, Sylvia, you and I, when we were starting this, you also mentioned that NEJAC is accepting nominations. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that as well.
Absolutely, thank you. And so I shared a link to, I'm not sure if folks have seen it there, but the NEJAC is broken up into also the regions. So we represent from a stakeholder group, but also from a region. And so if you go to the EPA's website for NEJAC, you'll see a map of the regions, and then you'll also see a link for the application to apply to be a member of NEJAC. And so we're looking for representatives from some other regions. We've got enough in some, but not enough in others. And so usually the terms are about 3 years, and oftentimes they're also extended for another 3 years. So it's a really engaging space for anyone who really is trying to bring forward the issues and the understandings that they have for the work that they do in environmental justice. I think you'll find it really rewarding.
Wonderful, thank you. And we did post that link
you.
in the Facebook chat as well. So thank you for highlighting that. I want to say to our audience, thank you for joining us for tea today. An upcoming programming note, you know, we do these teas every other Thursday. So our next tea will be in 2 weeks on March 25th. And we are going to continue the conversation on environmental justice. And Jan, Sylvia, and Mike, thank you again so much for being with us and
pleasure.
challenging us and giving us this information. We know these conversations never really end, so look forward to talking more and doing the work. And thank you all so much.
Yeah,
Thank
please
you.
stay in touch.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.